Hi, this is Andre. I want to talk about the general concept of multiple loops in the Echoplex Digital Pro. Thank you to Mark Oswald for commissioning this video. Multiple loops is a big subject because there are a lot of different parameters that you can experiment with and a lot of different aspects of recording and switching between multiple loops that you can configure. So it's a lot more than I feel comfortable covering in one video or even 2 or 3 videos. There's going to be a lot that we go into in detail in subsequent installments, but I also want to give a general overview so that you can get a basic sense of what's involved with the lay of the land. I also want to try and demystify this top parameter row a little bit. The bad news is that if you go to the top parameter row, every one of these parameters has to do with some aspect of multiple loops. That's the bad news. The good news is, I would say that 3 of these you basically don't need to worry about unless you're doing very, very specific kind of MIDI-related work, or in case you're trying to change the number of loops. Let's talk about that first and foremost. More loops tells you how many loops you're dividing the Echoplex memory into. This is how many different loops you can switch between. You can't have multiple loops playing simultaneously, unfortunately. You can only have one loop playing at a time. If you have one loop, you have 198 seconds of time. That's the maximum amount of time you can have. The more loops that you have that you can switch between, the more you're dividing the overall Echoplex memory. So the higher the number of loops, the shorter the length of time for each of those individual loops. So you can see as we increase the number of loops, the available loop time for each of those loops gets smaller. It's worth pointing out also that loop time doesn't just refer to how long the loop can be, it also refers to memory use. And that's useful to be aware of if you get into things like using undo or things like windowing. In cases like that, you oftentimes are going to want to have a lot of memory available. What that means is, let's say you have it set to 4 loops, and each of those 4 loops has 49.5 seconds. If you record a 5-second loop with that setting, you're not going to have as much memory available for undo or windowing or those kinds of functions as if you record a loop of the same length with just 1 loop. You're going to have a lot more memory available for things like undo and windowing. So if you don't do undo or windowing or things like that, it doesn't really matter. But just to be aware, in its most basic sense, the more loops you have, the more loop time you're losing, but you're also losing potential layers of undoable memory. The next multiple loops parameter is auto record. Auto record has to do with what happens when you enter a loop that doesn't have anything in it yet. If it's set off, then you'll go into your new loop, but nothing will happen until you specifically start recording something. If it's set on, then you will automatically start recording as soon as you enter into an empty loop. The third parameter is loop copy. This determines whether or not you copy the content of your current loop into an empty loop when you enter it. It's similar to auto record in the sense that this has a lot to do with what happens when you enter an empty loop. It's not surprising, therefore, that loop copy overwrites auto record. So if loop copy is set to anything other than off, time, or sound, then that basically overwrites whatever the value of auto record is. So even if you have auto record off, if you have loop copy set to sound or time, it's going to copy the loop into your new empty loop location. So time only copies the length of the loop. It doesn't copy the actual audio of a loop. This would be particularly useful if you're dealing with sync, if you're using the EDP either as a master or a slave that's synchronized to something else, and you want to make sure that even though the loop content might be different, you want the lengths of the loops to be exactly the same. That's a good reason for using time. Sound will copy the entire loop, not just the length, but the audio content as well when you enter into a new loop that doesn't have anything in it yet. This is a really good way of developing material in a loop, changing it around a bit, and then having earlier versions of that loop stored in other loop locations. So you can do a lot of development and then go back to earlier iterations of that loop, that sort of idea. Now let's talk about switch quantization. This has to do with whether or not you jump directly into a new loop when you select a new loop, or if you have a delay. If it's set off, then hitting next loop or accessing the number of a loop via MIDI will immediately switch into that loop with no delay whatsoever. All of these other values have to do with waiting until certain points before you make the switch into a new loop. Some of these have to do with certain points in the EDP loop. Some of them have to do with waiting for a second button press to confirm that you want to switch. Some of them are combinations of both of those. So switch quantization has to do with whether or not you jump directly into a loop or whether you wait for one or more points in the loop or one or more commands that you can make. The next two values are frankly not very important unless you're using MIDI control. If you're not using MIDI at all, you don't have to worry about these. If you are using MIDI, then I'll simply say that loop trigger determines the MIDI number that the first loop is going to be assigned to. This means that if you're configuring a MIDI controller to switch between loops, loop number 1 is going to respond to MIDI note 84, loop number 2 will respond to 85, and so forth. You can change those numbers if you're so inclined. It's pretty rare that you would need to do that, quite honestly. There are occasions where you might need to be very particular about how you configure controllers. Maybe you need to have your first loop accessed by a number that's higher than 84 for whatever reason. So you have the option to do that. You can start it quite a bit higher than that if you need to, but the default value is 84. Velocity has to do with whether or not accessing a loop via MIDI is going to be affected by the velocity of that note command. Basically, velocity in MIDI, in the most simple way, describes how loud or quiet the note is. If you have a quiet note, it's going to have a low velocity. If you have a louder note, it's said to have a higher velocity. That means that if you have velocity turned on, and you have a loop assigned to a particular key, and you hit that key really hard on your controller, the loop volume is going to play back louder than if you hit that key quieter. So how useful that is really going to be up to you. I personally never use it. Most people I know of don't use it. You might find a use for it, and one of the things that makes the Echoplex both very deep and occasionally very intimidating is that you have a lot of control over exactly how much you want to customize this stuff. This would also be applicable if you're using the EDP more like a sampler. Maybe you want to use it to trigger different loops you've recorded and you want to have it play back at particular times. In a case like that, you might find it useful to have velocity engaged. For the most part, though, I'm going to say that this is a pretty esoteric function that, for the most part, you don't need to worry about. The final value is sampler style. Sampler style has to do with what happens when you enter a new loop. The two main values you have are run and start. These are the two ones that you're going to deal with the most. There are two other values. One is kind of a special effect that I'm not going to really go into any detail about right now. Attack is more based on MIDI control. The two primary sampler style values then are run and start. If you have it set to run, then every time you jump into a new loop, you're going to pick up wherever you last were in that loop. So let's say you're in loop number 1, you leave a 5-second loop at 2 seconds into that loop, and you go to loop 2. If you go back to loop 1, you're going to pick up in loop 1 right where you left off, at the 2 seconds in point. If you have it set to start, on the other hand, every time you jump into a new loop, you're going to restart from the very beginning of that loop. It doesn't matter where you left off when you were last in that loop. Jumping to that new loop value is going to restart the loop from the very beginning. Again, one is kind of a cool esoteric function. We'll get to that eventually. Attack has to do more with MIDI triggering. So, if you're not using MIDI at all, you don't need to worry about velocity. And as long as you configure your controller to access your first loop correctly, then you don't need to worry about that. Once you have your multiple loops value set, you don't really need to worry about that, especially since, for better or worse, you can't actually change this once you've started recording a loop. In other words, you can't start off with the memory divided into 3 different loops and then say, oh, I want to have a 4th loop, and then switch that value while you actually have a loop going. You can only change this value while you're in reset. So I usually recommend starting with 2 or 3 loops, something that's manageable, and then gradually working your way out from there. So, the important parameters to be aware of when you start working with multiple loops are going to be auto record, loop copy, switch quantization, and sampler style. And with sampler style, you only really need to worry about the first 2, run or start. Also, if you're using loop copy, you don't have to worry about auto record because loop copy basically overwrites auto record. So if you're doing any kind of loop copying, you only need to worry about loop copy, switch quantization, and sampler style as your parameters. If you're using auto record, then you don't really need to worry about loop copy. So for most applications for multiple loops, especially if this is a new area for you, you're only going to need to deal with switch quantization, sampler style, and again, one of the first two sampler style values, and either auto record or loop copy. There may be some esoteric situations where you will end up using both of these in one playing session. I sure can't think of any right now off the top of my head. So for right now, let's safely say you're not going to need to worry about auto record and loop copy at the same time. If somebody out there thinks of an exception to that, please send me a nasty email and I will be sure and try and correct it as soon as possible. So like I say, multiple loops are a big subject. There are a lot of possibilities for configuring it in a lot of different ways. We're going to get to those in subsequent videos, but this is kind of a general overview of the table of contents, if you want to think of it that way. This is a general guideline to what you're getting into if you choose to investigate more loops. Thanks again to Mark Oswald for commissioning this video. Thank you for tuning in. We will get into this more soon, and we will get into some more Echoplex stuff next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.